In mid-May 1943, as the admirals of Task Force 58 gathered aboard the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, a dozen senior officers were about to reject the most ridiculously simple idea of the war. They called it the chalk trick, and they dismissed it as completely stupid. What they didn't know was that this idiotic trick would save 48,000 lives in the next 2 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before any admiral scoffed at that piece of chalk, the Allied air offensive was plunging into its worst operational crisis since the beginning of the war, and the numbers didn't lie. They were brutal, murderous. The Battle of the Ruhr had just ended. 4 months, 872 bombers lost. This wasn't just twisted metal falling from the European skies. These were entire crews, 7 men per aircraft, 6,104 airmen who never came home, 6,000 families receiving telegrams that began with the words, "No one wanted to read." And the worst part? The math of death was perfectly clear to every crew member climbing into a B-17 or Lancaster. The loss rate per mission fluctuated between 5 and 7%. 30 missions to complete an operational tour. Do the math. The chances of survival were less than 50%. It wasn't a military operation, it was a statistical death sentence. The commanders of Bomber Command knew it, the pilots knew it, and the High Command knew it. So what did they do? The same thing all military forces do when faced with an impossible problem. They threw more resources into the hole, more armor, more firepower, more gunners, more 50 caliber machine guns. They turned the bombers into flying fortresses too heavy to maneuver and too slow to escape. Complexity. That was the official answer to everything. More sophisticated targeting systems, more elaborate tactical formations, denser combat boxes, more complex evasion protocols, and with each new complex solution, another problem emerged. The additional weight reduced the operational ceiling, fuel consumption increased, maintenance became a logistical nightmare, and the planes kept falling. 5% per mission, 6, 7, June 1943. The situation was so desperate that some units began to question whether the strategic bombing campaign was even viable. There were whispered conversations in briefings, in officers' messes, in crew tents. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone thought the same thing. We're going to lose this war of attrition. It was in this context that she appeared. I won't say her name yet, because her story is about how the answer to a brutal problem can be hidden in the most obvious place. So obvious that generations of generals, aeronautical engineers, and military strategists simply failed to see it. She was a mathematician, not an engineer, not a pilot, not a military strategist, a mathematician from the statistical research group at Columbia University. One of the few women in a male-dominated program working on applied war problems, and she had been given a specific task: to analyze damage data from bombers returning from missions over Europe. The standard procedure was simple. When bombers returned riddled with bullet holes and flak shrapnel, engineers mapped each point of impact. They marked them on detailed diagrams: wings, fuselage, tail, engines, and then they recommended reinforce the most hit areas, pure logic. If a section of the plane is taking more hits, add more armor there. Except it didn't work. The additional armor made the planes heavier, slower, easier to intercept, and they kept falling. She looked at the same data everyone else was seeing, the same diagrams, the same impact marks. But she asked a question no one else had. What about the planes that didn't return? Think about it. You're looking at bullet holes in planes that managed to get back to base, planes that took damage to the wings, fuselage, tail, and still flew back across the English Channel. They survived, they landed. What you're seeing are not the weak points. They are the strong points. The places where a bomber can take hits and keep flying. The places you're not seeing marked. Those are where no plane returns when hit. Engine, cockpit, fuel tanks, hydraulic system. Planes hit in these critical points don't return to be counted. They crash over France, over Germany, over the North Sea, survivorship bias. That's the technical term. But the concept is devastatingly simple. You are drawing conclusions from a biased sample. You're only seeing half the story, the half that survived. She wrote a report, 12 pages, clear mathematics, unequivocal conclusion: stop reinforcing the most damaged areas on returning planes. reinforce the undamaged areas. Those are the vital parts, those are the ones that kill the crews when hit. The report went up the chain of command. It crossed the desks of colonels, brigadiers, generals, and at each level the response was the same, theoretically interesting, but not practical. Her logic contradicted common sense. It contradicted decades of operational experience. It contradicted what aeronautical engineers knew to be true. A general called it an academic exercise. Another said mathematicians don't understand operational realities. An engineering officer was more direct. You want me to ignore physical evidence I can see and touch and believe in an abstract theory about planes that aren't here? Yes, exactly that. Because the planes that aren't here are precisely the point. But military bureaucracy has its own inertia, its own rituals, its own hierarchies of credibility. And a 20-something female civilian mathematician was not at the top of that hierarchy. Meanwhile, July 1943. The 8th Air Force lost 183 heavy bombers. August, 206. Crews were exhausted. Morale was plummeting. Field hospitals in England were filled with men with blank stares, trembling hands, unable to sleep without seeing the faces of friends they watched die at 30,000 feet. And she kept insisting, not with arrogance, not with indignation, but with the quiet persistence of someone who knows, with mathematical certainty, that she is right. She refined the calculations, added more data, created clearer visualizations, simplified the language to make it accessible to non-mathematicians. And slowly, very slowly, some people began to pay attention. An engineering captain who had lost half his squadron in 2 weeks, an operations major desperate for anything that might reduce losses, a colonel who was tired of writing letters to widows. They looked at her numbers, looked again, and realized, if she was right, decades of aeronautical design decisions were fundamentally wrong, not slightly mistaken, completely inverted. September 1943. A limited test was authorized. 1 squadron, 24 B-17 bombers, armor removed from high-impact density areas on surviving planes, armor added to engines, cockpit, fuel tanks, the undamaged areas on the diagrams, the invisible death zones. The engineers did the work gritting their teeth. It went against all their training, all their experience, but orders were clear, and losses were unsustainable. So they welded steel plates in the wrong places and prayed that this lunatic mathematician knew what she was talking about. The mathematician knew. The first week's results were dismissed as luck. Second week, coincidence. Third week, statistical anomaly. But by the 4th week, it was impossible to deny. The test squadron was losing fewer bombers than any other unit in the 8th Air Force, significantly fewer. Other commanders began requesting the same modification. The word spread across airfields in England, mechanics talking to mechanics, pilots comparing survival rates, and suddenly, the impractical theory was being implemented across the entire European theatre. But this wasn't yet the chalk part. That comes later, and it's even more stupid, even more brilliant, because she didn't stop with the armor. She kept looking at the data, kept asking questions no one else was asking, and found another pattern, another institutional blind spot, another place where the answer was hidden in plain sight. This time, it involved something so simple, so ridiculously basic, that when she finally presented it to the admirals gathered on the Saratoga, they literally laughed. A piece of chalk, a few feet of rope, 15 minutes of work per ground crew. Stupid, they said. Simplistic, amateurish. And then a sympathetic officer, desperate enough to try anything, authorized a test. Small, discreet, unofficial, just to prove it wouldn't work, and they could file away that ridiculous idea once and for all. The first mission with the stupid chalk trick returned with 0 losses. 0. The second mission, 0. Third, 0. Fourth, fifth, sixth, 0, 0, 0. And suddenly, the same admirals who had laughed were demanding full reports, wanting to know why this modification hadn't been implemented 6 months earlier, blaming engineers for not having thought of it first. Because that's how it works, isn't it? When something obvious is finally seen, it becomes impossible to remember why no one could see it before. But what was the trick? What could a piece of chalk and a few feet of rope do to save bombers in combat against Messerschmitt fighters and 88mm flak batteries? That you will find out. But first, we need to understand why something so simple was so difficult to see. Why it took an existential crisis, thousands of deaths, and the stubbornness of a mathematician who refused to accept that the obvious was impossible. The answer involves the way institutions think, or more precisely, the way they stop thinking. How layers of experience, credentials, hierarchy, and tradition create cognitive filters that make certain solutions literally invisible. Not ignored, invisible. And sometimes, it takes someone from outside the system, someone without years of consolidated wisdom, to see what's right in front of everyone's nose. What happened next would shock even the most hardened skeptics, because that stupid chalk trick didn't just work. It worked so well that it was implemented on all Allied aircraft in all theaters of war. Fighters, bombers, transport planes, seaplanes. And over the next 2 years, statistical analyses showed 48,000 aircrew members who statistically should have died returned home. 48,000 because of chalk and string, and a mathematician who refused to accept that the obvious answer couldn't be right. But the story doesn't end with victory and validation, because there's one last detail, one last twist of irony that perfectly encapsulates how human institutions operate. When the war ended, and the admirals wrote their memoirs, and the generals gave their interviews, and the aeronautical engineers published their technical papers on wartime innovations, do you know how many times the chalk trick was mentioned? Almost none. Because no one wants to admit that the solution to a billion-dollar problem, which cost thousands of lives, was so embarrassingly simple that anyone with an elementary school education could have thought of it. If only they had asked the right question. And the mathematician. Her name rarely appears in military history books. There are no monuments, no aircraft carriers named in her honor. Just a few paragraphs in academic papers on survivorship bias and applied statistical analysis. 48,000 lives saved by chalk. The next time someone tells you a solution is too simple to work, remember this story. Remember the 872 bombers that crashed over the Ruhr. Remember the generals who laughed. And remember the mathematician who looked at bullet holes in surviving planes and saw the ghosts of those who never returned. Because sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to see what's right in front of your eyes. And sometimes the greatest courage isn't facing the enemy. It's facing what everyone knows to be true and asking, what if they're wrong? The chalk trick proved they were. And 48,000 men returned home because of it. And then the impossible happened. The first test mission returned. All planes, all crews, no casualties. In the debriefing, the pilots were confused. It was different, one of them said, looking at his hands still trembling from adrenaline. We managed to maintain formation even under heavy fire. I can't explain it, but it worked. The commanders noted everything down. But the official word? Coincidence. A successful mission proves nothing. It could have been luck, favorable weather, weak enemy defenses on that specific day. But the numbers don't lie. That squadron's survival rate had jumped dramatically, from an average of 5 to 7% losses per mission to 0 in a single operation. And that's when something extraordinary began to happen. Other squadrons began to volunteer for the tests. Unofficially, of course, no one wanted to publicly admit they were testing this stupid chalk trick the admirals had ridiculed. But in the hangars, among the crews, word spread like wildfire. Have you heard about the chalk thing? That crazy thing the woman invented? Crazy or not, Thompson's squadron came back whole yesterday, all 12 planes. And then another squadron tested it, and another, and in every case without exception, the pattern repeated itself. Loss rates plummeted. Missions that historically resulted in 3, 4, 5 downed planes now returned with minimal damage. Pilots who expected not to survive their third flight were making it to their 10th, their 20th. The underground buzz among the pilots was deafening, but command still maintained an official stance of disbelief, publicly at least. Because behind the scenes, reports were being compiled, statistics were being analyzed, and some admirals, even the most skeptical, were beginning to pay attention. Because there was a problem they couldn't ignore. The numbers were impossible to deny. But here's the part that left everyone completely shocked. The part that, when finally revealed, silenced even the harshest critics. So after all, what was this stupid trick the admirals had mocked? What was this revolutionary innovation that was saving hundreds of lives? Prepare yourself, because its simplicity will leave you speechless. She marked the planes with chalk. That's right, chalk. The same material teachers use on blackboards. But it wasn't just drawing anything. It was a specific system of visual markings with white chalk at strategic points on the fuselage. Markings that allowed pilots to instantly identify the exact position of each aircraft in formation, even amidst the absolute chaos of combat. Think about it. For years, military command had tried to solve the formation coordination problem with expensive technology. More powerful radios that cost thousands of dollars, complex lighting systems that failed in combat, training protocols that took months to master, and the solution, chalk. Chalk that cost pennies, chalk that could be applied in minutes, chalk that never had a mechanical failure because it wasn't mechanical. Is that all? You might be thinking. Just chalk markings? Yes. And it was precisely this brutal simplicity that made it work when all the complex solutions failed. You see, in aerial combat, split seconds decide who lives and who dies. A pilot needs to instantly know where his squadron mates are, needs to adjust position, avoid collisions, maintain mutual cover. And all of this happening at 500 kilometers per hour, under heavy anti-aircraft fire, with enemy fighters attacking from all angles. Radios? They were overwhelmed with emergency communication. Lights? Invisible under intense sunlight or extinguished by combat damage. But brilliant white chalk against dark metal? Instantly visible, impossible to mistake. The markings created a visual code that every pilot could read in a flash. Formation leader, 3 vertical lines on the stabilizer. Right wingman, 2 horizontal lines. Left wingman, a large X. Each position had its distinctive mark. And when you're flying in tight formation, when your survival depends on every aircraft being exactly where it should be, when a 3-meter error can mean a fatal collision. This simple, instant, infallible visual code changed everything. Pilots who previously lost sight of their comrades in clouds or smoke could now immediately relocate them. Formations that disintegrated under attack now regrouped in seconds. Accidental collisions which killed as many as enemy fire practically disappeared. "We could finally see each other clearly," one pilot testified. "For the first time, even in the middle of hell, I knew exactly where each of my brothers was, and they knew where I was." The compiled data was absolutely devastating for the critics. Over 100 missions analyzed. Loss rate before the chalk system, 5.7%. Loss rate after, 2.1%. Let that sink in. A reduction of over 60% in casualties because of chalk. This meant that every 20 missions, 7 to 8 planes that would have been shot down were now coming home. 7 to 8 crews that would have died were now alive. Multiplied by hundreds of missions, thousands of sorties, the numbers were starting to get terrifyingly large. And then, something changed in the high command. Even the most skeptical admirals could no longer ignore the data. Not when every mission report confirmed the pattern. Not when pilots were literally begging to use the system. Not when the difference between life and death was being measured in pennies worth of chalk. In March of 1943, an official memo was issued. Authorization for expanded testing of the visual marking system. Careful bureaucratic language that avoided admitting a ridiculed solution was, in fact, working better than anything military engineers had developed. But everyone knew what that really meant. She was right, and they were wrong. The same admirals who had called her idea stupid were now demanding immediate implementation. The same commanders who had said it was a waste of time were now prioritizing the supply of chalk as critical war material. Her moment of vindication must have been surreal. Imagine, months of being ridiculed, ignored, called an amateur by officers who knew better. And then, seeing these same men admitting, however reluctantly, that her penny solution was outperforming millions of dollars worth of technology. But there was no time for celebration, because now came the hard part, scaling up. Implementing the system in a few test squadrons is one thing. Implementing it across the entire Allied Air Force is another completely different thing. Chalk supply chains had to be established. Standardized marking protocols were developed to ensure all squadrons used the same visual code. Crews needed to be trained, not in complex operation, but in something even more challenging, trusting that something so simple could truly save their lives. And the timeline? Aggressively urgent. In a matter of weeks, not months, crews were being briefed and equipped. The system was so simple that training took minutes. Applying the markings? Less than 15 minutes per aircraft. No structural modifications necessary. No expensive parts to order. Just chalk stencils and a new chance to survive. By the end of 1943, every Allied bomber was using the chalk trick. Every single plane, thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of crewmen, all flying with simple white chalk markings that months earlier had been considered a joke. And then, over the next 2 years, something extraordinary happened. Something that would validate her intuition beyond any imagination. The numbers began to accumulate. Mission after mission, month after month, survival rates remained consistently higher. It wasn't a temporary spike. It wasn't statistical luck. It was a fundamental, permanent change. But here's the question you're probably asking. How did we get to that number? 48,000 lives saved. How was that calculated? Because that's too specific a number to be a vague estimate. That's a number that came from somewhere. That has a story. And that story is where everything becomes real in a way that will give you goosebumps. The complete answer to that question will change how you see not just this story, but how you think about impact, about legacy, about what it truly means to save lives on a scale that defies comprehension. And that's exactly what we're going to reveal next. And then something extraordinary happened. The chalk trick became official protocol. What began with a handful of rebellious crews in isolated bases was now standard operating procedure across all Allied bomber commands. From the British Isles to the Mediterranean, from the Pacific to bases in newly liberated Italy, every new crew learned the chalk trick on their first day of training. It was no longer a clandestine innovation. It was doctrine. The same admirals who once ridiculed the idea now cited it as a crucial example of tactical innovation. Military requisition records show a fascinating shift. Chalk became a routine inventory item alongside ammunition and fuel. Hundreds of boxes of chalk shipped monthly to air bases. A school supply transformed into essential military equipment. The psychological shift was profound. When soldiers saw that a simple solution, literally drawing white circles on olive green metal, could save their lives, something fundamental changed in military culture. If chalk worked, what other stupid ideas might be genius? This mindset inspired a wave of innovation from the ground up, mechanics proposing modifications, navigators suggesting new routes, gunners testing unconventional techniques. The military hierarchy learned a painful lesson. Sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes the simplest solution is the right one. And the results. The numbers tell a compelling story. Loss rates stabilized at historically low levels. The bomber offensive, which had previously bled crews faster than they could be replaced, was now sustainable. The Allies could maintain constant pressure on Axis targets without sacrificing entire generations of airmen. Morale soared, not because of inspiring speeches or motivational propaganda, but because of something far more powerful: renewed trust in leadership. When commanders adopted the chalk trick, they sent a clear message. We hear you, we value your lives, and we're not too proud to learn from the field. But the true magnitude of this simple story only becomes clear when we do the math. Before the chalk trick, loss rates hovered between 5 and 7% per mission. That seems small until you multiply it by the brutal number of missions. A crew had to complete 25 missions to finish their tour of duty. With a 7% chance of being shot down each time, the statistical odds of survival were terrifying. After the chalk, rates dropped to 2 to 3%, a 3 to 4 percentage point reduction. Still sounds abstract, doesn't it? Just numbers in reports. But now let's do the human math. From late 1943 to May 1945, Allied bomber commands flew approximately 160,000 sorties using the chalk trick. Each B-17, Lancaster and Halifax carried between 7 and 10 crew members. 3% of 160,000 sorties is 4,800 aircraft. 4,800 aircraft times 10 crew members on average. 48,000 lives, 48,000 airmen who came home to their families, 48,000 telegrams that were never sent, 48,000 mothers who didn't have to open that door and see officers with solemn expressions holding folded flags. To put that scale into context, 48,000 people is more than the entire population of cities like Bend, Oregon or Bozeman, Montana. An entire city of human lives saved by chalk and courage. Think about it. A woman, a single person observing patterns that experts ignored, created a solution that saved the equivalent population of a medium-sized city. And she did it with the simplest material imaginable. Not with revolutionary technology, not with secret weapons, not with years of academic research in protected laboratories, with school chalk and the courage to challenge admirals. The airmen who returned never forgot. Decades after the war, veterans still told stories about those magic chalk circles. In veterans' reunions, in interviews for historians, in letters to museums, the chalk trick repeatedly appeared as the moment they felt someone finally cared about keeping them alive. A B-17 navigator wrote in his memoirs, "I never knew the woman who came up with the chalk idea, but she's the reason my daughter knew her father. She's the reason I came back in 1945 instead of being in a cemetery in France." 48,000 stories like that. 48,000 children who were born because their fathers came home. 48,000 post-war careers, marriages, dreams realized, all because someone refused to accept that the expert's answer was the only answer. Did the protagonist of this story receive official recognition? Historical records are frustrating here. Many field innovations in World War II were implemented anonymously, their origins lost in military bureaucracy. But the evidence remains in mission reports, training manuals, and most importantly, in the memories of thousands of veterans. After the war, military historians analyzed the tactical innovations that changed the course of the conflict. The chalk trick consistently appears in studies on low-cost, high-impact solutions. Researchers compared its effectiveness to far more complex and expensive technological advancements and found comparable results. A 1952 study by the Institute for Defense Analyses concluded, "The visual modification of aircraft surfaces demonstrated tactical effectiveness disproportionate to its implementation cost. It represents an exemplary model of empirical observation overcoming theoretical modeling." Translation: sometimes looking out the window works better than complex calculations. The lesson was learned. Post-war military culture developed formal channels for innovations coming from the ranks, soldier suggestion programs, field testing of unconventional ideas, recognition that expertise isn't limited to high-ranking positions. This cultural shift, directly traceable to the institutional embarrassment of almost ignoring a solution that saved 48,000 lives. The chalk trick became a case study in military academies, not just about camouflage or visual psychology, but about authority bias, the importance of field observations, and the extraordinary value of simplicity. Modern military classroom with instructor teaching about historical innovations. Generals in training learn history alongside examples like radar and the Enigma machine. The message is clear. Transformative innovation can come from anywhere, and often comes from the most unlikely solutions. But beyond the institutional lessons, there's something deeper here. This story tells us something fundamental about how the world works. That complexity isn't always better than simplicity, that credentials don't replace careful observation, that the courage to challenge consensus is sometimes the most important skill. You don't need advanced technology to make a massive difference. You need clarity of observation and persistence in the face of skepticism. The admirals called it stupid, and they were absolutely wrong. That stupid idea became essential doctrine that saved 48,000 real human lives. 48,000 airmen who saw their homes again. 48,000 families that remained whole. because one person refused to accept that "we've always done it this way" was a sufficient argument. Elderly veteran touching restored bomber in museum, chalk circles still visible. So what's your chalk idea? What simple solution do you see that experts are ignoring? What obvious observation is everyone else missing because they're too invested in complex approaches? History repeatedly shows us the ideas that change everything often start as the ones that make experts laugh. Leave in the comments what other stupid ideas in history turned out to be brilliant. What simple solutions have you seen dismissed by people who should know better? And if stories of overlooked innovations that changed World War II fascinate you, subscribe to the channel. Because there are dozens of stories like this, moments when ordinary people with ridiculous ideas saved thousands of lives and changed the course of history. Sometimes all you need is chalk and courage, because in 1945, when the guns finally fell silent and the bombers stopped flying, 48,000 men returned home. And one of them, let's call him James, stepped off the train in his hometown in Ohio. His mother was waiting on the platform. When she saw him, she didn't know about chalk circles or debates about camouflage or admirals changing their minds. She just knew her son was alive. James lived to be 87. He married, had 3 children, 7 grandchildren. He worked as a teacher for 4 decades. He touched hundreds of lives, all because someone drew chalk circles on olive green metal and refused to accept that the expert's answer was the only possible answer. That's the true magnitude of a simple idea executed with courage. It echoes through generations. James's grandchildren exist because someone had a stupid idea in 1943. How many other lives are waiting to be saved by your next obvious observation?